Now. Okay, so good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to the first event of 2025, the Global Daoist Studies Forum. I am David Mosina of the University of Cambridge, your host today. 晚上好，欢迎参加2025年全球道教研究论坛的第一次活动。我叫 David Mosina 莫达夫，我是剑桥大学亚洲与中东研究学院的研究员。我是今天活动的主持人。今晚我们会讨论两本新出版的书籍。So, as I just said, we are delighted to introduce and discuss two recently published books in Daoist Studies. The first book is Religion and Poetry in Medieval China, The Way and the Words, edited by Gil Raz and Anna Shields. It was published by Amsterdam University Press in December 2023. The second volume is Communicating with the Gods, Spirit Writing in Chinese History and Society, edited by Matthias Schumann and Elena Valussi. It was published by Brill in October 2023. We'll first hear from the editors who introduce us to their volumes, and then intermittently, we are fortunate to have Professor Vincent Goossaert of France's L'École Pratique des Hautes Études, who will lead a discussion of these two books with the editors. Professor Goossaert is, we all know, the author of many books. The most recent one is The Beef Taboo, Agriculture, Ethics, Sacrifice, which is a translation by Professor Barbara Ambrose of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, of Professor Goossaert's 2005 book in French, L'Interdit du Boeuf en Chine. The translated book will come out next month from the University of Hawaii Press. So after the discussion, in about an hour or so, we'll open things up to everyone in a Q&A session. Matthias Schumann, one of the editors of Communicating with the Gods, will join us then. So I'll turn it over now to Elena, I believe, or no, to Anna and Gil. So take it away.
Well, I see everyone's waiting. I should probably. My name is Gil Raz from Dartmouth College, and along with Anna Shields, we co-edited the volume one of the volumes we discussed today, Religion and Poetry in Medieval China. I think Anna asked me to go first because religion comes before poetry in the title of the book, so I guess that's fair enough. Um, this is a volume that was a long time in coming. We had not actually planned to have a volume initially. It was a conference we held in 2017 in honor of our both of our advisors, Steve Bokenkamp, and we gathered several of his friends and students to give papers, and the papers turned out to be very good. People really brought their A game to this. And we decided to make it into a volume. And eventually we ended up with 10 chapters. There were a few more papers presented at the conference. For various reasons, those had dropped out. Um, and it was a long time in coming through the COVID and finding um, our publisher, eventually selling in Amsterdam University Press. But more importantly, I think what I liked about this working with this volume is that although we didn't ask anybody to particularly pay attention to any particular themes or to focus on anything in particular, there is a quite a coherence in the volume itself, and the papers do talk to each other, although not purposefully, but the way they came out, the way people thought about this, really made it quite coherent, and I thought that was one of the interesting things to work in. So when we wrote our introduction, we could really point to a variety of common themes, and I think this is something that we might want to talk about in more detail later on in the Q&A. Um, this is sort of the basic introduction to this, and I think Anna might have a lot to add, so maybe it's her turn now.
Right. Thanks, Gil. First, I want to very warmly thank Elena, David, Vincent, and everyone attending for being here. I joked before we started that I'm really Waihang, since I guess most people know that I'm more a scholar of literature than I am of Taoism. But Gil and I did have the honor of being the first and second PhD students to study under Steve Bogenkamp, and therefore this conference really was intended to bring together a wide range of scholars and students of Steve's work. And I would argue that I think of the many strengths of the volume, which I will hold up right here, since we do not have a PowerPoint, Religion and Poetry in Medieval China, lovely cover, Gil chose the image, is its interdisciplinarity, that we very much tasked people with, as Gil said, we were very happy that people brought their A game, but we tasked people to think in the spirit of Steve Bogenkamp's work, which is to say, to pay close attention to philology, to contextual studies, a keen historicist approach to both the linguistic, social, ritual dimensions, for example, of texts, and that very much played out in the essays. Curiously, well, two things. One, I would say about the title, which is that the title should have been The Way and the Words, which was the title that Gil thought up for this conference back in, goodness, it was 2013 or 2014. But AUP, in the interest of keywords, wanted something vaguer for the actual title, which unfortunately I think has the effect of reifying a feature of the field that we were really fighting against, which is the kind of siloing into religious studies and literary studies, and specifically poetry. When I think what the essays do as a whole is work across those boundaries really beautifully, essay after essay. I would also say that the essays, so there's an introduction that was co-written by Gil and me, and then Steve Bogenkamp contributed a fantastic kind of tour de force epilogue that reflects on the single term, Jinque, the golden port, and its evolving translations, and how it becomes not just a philological exercise, but an essay on the evolution of Daoist studies. And so I highly recommend that. The other thing that I would say about the volume that's a little less than transparent, because we grouped the essays, the 10 essays, into 3 sections. And this is discussed in the introduction, but actually there are no page numbers that show you that. And so the first 4 essays are on poetry and kind of literary culture more generally. And those essays are one by John Pettit, which is called Brushing Past Rainbows, Religion and Poetry in the Xumi Stele, which translates in a very close reading of a stele inscription from 519 by Tao Hongting, that examines kind of esoteric topography in the text itself and its relation to the site. And so there's a great deal of attention throughout the essays in the dynamic between a cited text, where we have them, kind of materiality of the text, and its discursive exploration. The second essay in this section is Li Bo and Hu Ziyang, which looks at Li Bo's stele for the Taoist master Hu Ziyang after his death. It was composed at his tomb site, but also examines Li Bo's relationship to the Buddhist monk Zhen Tian, who was the one who actually requested Li Bo to compose the stele for Hu Ziyang. And I would argue that Paul's essay does many, many things, but one of the really beautiful things that it reflects on is this, what Li Bo constantly refers to as shenjiao, a kind of spiritual relationship, a spiritual connection. And I think it's a great essay to think about the resonance of shenjiao in Tang culture. The third essay is by Franciscus Varela, which I assume will play some part perhaps in the forthcoming monograph, on the Taoist poetry of the late Tang general and enormous towering figure Gao Pian. And he looks at poetry, particularly on Pacing the Void, but a lot of Taoist-themed poetry from Gao Pian's late life, after serving as the victorious general over Huang Zhao. My essay is the fourth in this section on poetry, and it's called Traces of the Way, the Poetry of Divine Transcendence in the Northern Song Anthology Wen Sui, Literature's Finest. And there I'm thinking about the category of shenxian as a literary lei, how it functions in an anthology that ostensibly has very, very different and what would later be characterized as Confucian objectives, and trying to think about how Daoist poetry or Tang poetry concerning Daoist themes survives and is reframed in the Northern Song, which is a problem I'm examining in a current book manuscript. But I guess I would say, with respect to poetry and kind of literature more generally, as it's represented in the text, in the volume as a whole, that certainly the poetry essays, but I think the rest of the essays reflect a great deal on the agency of texts, as their agency as sort of talismanic, numinous objects, something we're all familiar with, as scripts for performance. Rob Campany's essay is a terrific essay on the performative nature of some of the Shangqing texts. Text as possessing the power to reanimate, not merely commemorate, but reanimate social ties and social networks. This is something that Gil examines in his Buddha Daoist Stele essay. The geomantic potential of texts, again, this kind of agentic quality of text. And that's, for example, in John Pettit's article, and also text as a means of adopting alternate identities, as in Varellen's essay on Galpian, whether that is longing for transcendence, whether that is a voyage to celestial realms, that there's a tremendous generative kind of catalytic quality to poetry in particular for the medieval period. And then the last thing that I would say is that, having read the entire volume again a couple of times in the last few months, because it's the second kind of book talk that I've done, I do wish I'd had the opportunity to write, or perhaps with Steve, a meta essay on the role of poetry in medieval Taoism. It's kind of, whether we want to say privileged place or particularly generative role in medieval Taoism, that I think shifts very much after the Song. So I'll stop there, Gil.
Yeah, I just want to add a couple of things. So, and Anna had mentioned the title and the subtitle of the book, and we'd already started writing our introduction prior to the change in the title. But if you pay attention to the introduction, we actually have a great critique of the title. And I think one of the reasons that we had named the conference, and then we want to name the book The Way in the Words, is that, from my perspective, this is not an interdisciplinary book, simply because in medieval China, there were no disciplines that they were crossing. They were all reading each other's works. So while people would perhaps identify some points as Taoist or Buddhist or maybe physicians or something else, these definitions would be dynamic, and they would shift them in accordance to particular contexts. And that's something we really wanted to emphasize, both in introduction, but also in the way that we compiled the book. And as Anna said, we do have three sort of thematic parts, but we'd played around with different chapters could fit into different of these different parts. So it was more organizational. Something else I did want to point out
Gil, maybe a minute or two. Yeah.
Is that, in particular, the issue of the mixing of text. So in the section that's called where Wang Zongyu's chapter examines of the Lingbao Wufushu in the context of medical texts, or I talk about Buddhist and Taoist interactions, or James Robson's discussion of the Sutra of 42 sections, which its earliest version is in the Zhanggao. So all of these intermixtures of definition, or according to us, definitional categories, I think is extremely important, and perhaps why Taoism is so well hidden within other traditions. That's maybe where I'll stop.
Okay, thank you very much, Gil and Anna. Vincent.
Yeah, thanks. I need to unmute myself. Thank you so much, David, and all of you, for giving me this privilege to discuss the book, which was also a great opportunity to reread it and and think about it. Really very beautifully written and edited volume. Really happy to have this occasion to maybe raise five comments or questions. You'll see whether you find them interesting as questions. But so maybe the first one is sort of piggybacks on what you were commenting about the title and how you were more happy with just the way and the words than religion and poetry. But whether it's the way and the words or religion and poetry, I can't help notice that this is by and large a book that is written by scholars who know a lot about Taoism and would have a lot to say to the readers about Taoism, but Taoism is not in the title or subtitle. And I thought this to be actually a very clever and interesting way of making a move towards what several others, and in particular John Lagaway and Steve Bogenkamp himself say in their chapters, that is the need to recenter Taoism, to put it in the curriculum, to find gentle and persuasive and effective ways for scholars of Chinese history and culture to try to know more and understand more about Taoism without being patronizing or being frightening in the way they invite people to do more readings in Daoist studies. And that way to sort of tell the literary, cultural history of medieval China in a very Taoist-centric way, but without tagging it as a Taoist history of medieval China. I think this is a very convincing and hopefully very effective ways of contributing to this, what I would call a cause. I'm not sure it's a cause to you, but I do consider it as a worthy cause. And which, of course, is something we've been debating a lot, and that's not easy. And several of the chapters talk to that problem. I mean, of course, it's a daunting task for scholars of medieval Chinese literature to actually get to and to find their ways in the Taoist canon and to read Taoist scriptures. But at the same time, I should also point out that for scholars trained in Taoist studies and who, well, still not find it very easy to read everything in the Daozong, but I've been grappling with it for a long time for us, but who have not been trained in reading poetry, that's equally daunting, right? So when you come across poetry and you can get some sort of idea what it is about and why and how it could be interesting for your own research questions. But then really knowing how to read medieval Chinese poetry is nothing easy. And I think we need training going both ways. I mean, and curriculum merging going both ways here. So scholars of Taoism also need to that more training into non-Taoist text as well as the other way around. So that was sort of my first point. Second point is, so the book is called Medieval, and you explain in the introduction you take medieval in a very large sense, including the Han at the at one end and the Tang at the other end. So basically, the first millennium of the Common Era, and that's the age of manuscripts on paper, right? So you start with the time when and most things gets written by hand on paper, and you end when woodblock printing technology really takes off and changed the whole game entirely. And that's not something you really address frontally in the volume. You didn't have to. I certainly don't mean this as a criticism. Wang Zongyu's chapter talks a lot about manuscript culture in very interesting ways. And I also talk about how the canonization of earlier text in the Song, which is partly driven by the printing technology, also change things in the way texts are selected and reproduced and read. But I wonder if you had, when editing the volume or doing the conference or now, somewhere at the back of your mind, the question of the Tangsong transition and how the emergence of print culture changed things, including for the way religion was practiced in a very concrete, material way, or not, or if it's something that you would rather want to keep on the side for another field. But I mean, when you want to bring literary history and religious history in a dialogue. I mean, the question of book culture and book technologies is, I think, would I mean, everyone would benefit from bringing that field into the dialogue. Point number 3, and that's really a question. It's about the genres, and I was wondering whether you have an idea about the kind of literary genres that have been understudied and underused for the kind of work you've been doing and the contributors of the volume have been doing in terms of bringing together, I mean, cultural history, religious history, literary history. So there is a lot in the volume about poetry, about epigraphy as well, about scriptures. I wonder about other genres. I had the first one that jumped to mind is storytelling and all the Jugwai narratives, miracle stories, that kind of things. That and of course there have been great studies of those, including by Rob Campanis and others for the medieval period. But another one that is missing, and I'm here talking as an historian of the second millennium, so it's starting where you basically end, is where the performing arts and theater and in all its variety is completely central when we think about the connection between literature and religion and the way religious ideas and visions and imaginaries are conveyed to large audiences. In a way, I mean, writing the history of Taoism from the Song to the present could be done by writing the history of theater. It's not the only way, but it would be a meaningful way. And that dimension is absent from the volume because, of course, we have very little in terms of sources for performing arts before the song. But still, I mean, wonder whether you have, well, something to say about this remark. Point number 4, and that's specifically about poetry. It's also a naive question. And it relates to the central person in the volume with Steve Bokenkamp. And I remember asking him this question several years ago, as someone who has not been trained in reading poetry, as mentioning before, and was wondering whether poetry would be a great a gate to access the inner world, the personal experiences, including the religious experiences and visions and personal aspirations of authors, better than narratives or scriptures or more normative kinds of genres. And Steve basically told me, as if I remember what he said, that was just conversation. And he said, no, poetry should not be read as something that, sort of shed light on the inner world of individuals. That's not what medieval Chinese poetry does. So that was basically Steve's answer. But still, as the volume is a lot about poetry as a genre for religious history on the interactions between religious practices and poetry writing, I wonder whether you have your own take on this question and even might want to possibly disagree a little bit with Steve, who is not in the room, I think. So that's a possibility.
But we are recording.
Oh, that's right. That's right. We'll see. And then last question, and that's just a personal interest of mine, is the literary voice of non-humans. I'm interested in revelations and making the gods talk and speak and write. And of course, the volumes has a lot to say about revelations, lots of discussions of Shangxing practices, the Zhenggao and so on, and so on and so forth. Of course, other revelations as well, some translations of those revelations. But I wonder about God as authors, as having a personal literary style, and gods as introducing literary innovations. Do you see literary techniques, styles, writing practices that were introduced by the gods and not by humans in the medieval period? That's 10 minutes. I should stop here and you see if you can pick one or two among those questions that would make sense for you. Thank you again very much for the volume. Really beautiful, and it repays reading and rereading. Thank you.
Thank you, Vessa. Those are incredibly, incredibly good questions. Gil, you do you want to go first?
Sure. Thank you, Vincent. These are fantastic questions and really show really deep reading of all the essays and probably deeper thinking than I had done on many of them because I was editing them more than more than reading them that carefully. I think you're right about the title. The religion poetry, of course, was not our pick. The title "Way in the Words," I think, means for everybody knows means Taoism. I mean, there's no other way to understand that title except to talk about the Tao. So it's kind of hidden in there, and I think this, as you said, maybe it wasn't so much a gentle um, referencing as much as Taoism is hidden in Chinese culture. I mean, there's the more obvious when you read Taoist texts, but I think part of the problem that a lot of us face is that Taoism is so embedded and so intrinsic and so inherent to Chinese culture. Unless you really know what you're looking for, you sort of gloss over it. Unlike Buddhism, which although it becomes highly signified, if I want to use that word, it's always obvious what are Buddhist terms. But Taoist terminology and Taoist narratives and Taoist ideas and cosmologies are kind of lost very often because they're so basic. So I think one of the ways in which this volume is trying to perhaps kind of uncover Taoism is by saying, look, we're not going to call it Taoism. We'll just talk about stuff. You'll see the most basic stuff is right there. So we didn't want to use the word Taoism in title because it's about not just about Taoism, it's about many different religions and not just about it's about religious life. So that's part of the project is to actually help, kind of the way that Zhuangzi says, hiding the world in the world is much harder to sort of show you that. So I think the fact that you point that out, I think is actually really interesting because in some way, not that's this project, but also other projects that I'm involved in are trying to do the same thing. Is to sort of show that people do history or literature who are not quite aware of Taoism are missing a lot of what's actually happening. Um, Another point that the second point you mentioned about about print or manuscript culture, yeah, that was when I was editing Wang Zongyu's paper. He was the only one. He didn't really talk about the manuscript per se. He was talking more about more philology. Um, but when I was reading his material, so this is really about not just about philology. It's really about people copying manuscripts and thinking about manuscripts, and how we need to understand how texts were circulating and how they were being edited. And at some point, they become codified when they do get on woodblock prints or they get encoded into encyclopedias. And that's sort of what he's looking at is much later medical texts that are sort of codified, not so much canonized, but codified, and they in some way kind of maintain mistakes or maintain the non-mistakes. It's kind of hard to know which are the mistakes or which are the variants or which are the different recensions. But once they become codified, they're transmitted in multiple variants, and then it's very difficult to sort of recover what would have been the original Paris manuscripts. Again, think about what original manuscripts are. There is not necessarily any original manuscript at all. I mean, people keep looking at what would be the ur text of something. Well, the ur text is what came out of some person's mouth at some point. It was written down, but we do not have access to that. And I think um, working with this kind of material is sometimes hard for us to imagine what the text looks like because we are used to texts which are very much codified. The same kind of problem shows up in James Robson's article about or his chapter about the Scrooge 42 sections, which many people consider one of the most basic Buddhist texts, except that the earliest version we have is actually in the Zhanggao. It's not quite clear what's doing in the Zhanggao. So you can look at Steve's translation of that and his study of that in his more recent work on Zhanggao. But the main point is that these what we categorize as different religious texts are being transmitted within lineages that are not part of that particular religion, according to our definitions. And I think alongside manuscripts, we also need to think about how our categories don't quite hold up when we look very carefully at who is actually transmitting these texts. And also not quite clear sometimes how they're using the text. They're clearly cutting and pasting using very interesting ways that we're not quite aware of. Um, in my more recent work on the steles that I discuss in my chapter, so in the more recent work, I actually look also at how these steles, which are even, I mean, they really are codified, they're literally on stone, but the texts that they're using in the stele is very much are cut and paste from a variety of Buddhist texts and Taoist texts. So they're using these texts not as scriptures and not as holy word, but really as sort of repertoires of language in which they can take sometimes just very small pieces, just 2 characters or 4 characters, and create whole new coherent texts um, from that. So I think that's an interesting way to sort of think about how these things are being transmitted. Um, Now, one other question that I do not have an answer for actually, but I think it's a really excellent question, which is about the gods as literary innovators. This is a question I'm actually thinking about right now as I'm speaking, and I do not have an answer for you, but I think it's a very, very, very important um, question. I think one place to perhaps start is with texts such as Shangqing or Zhanggao, in which Yangshi is channeling a variety of different spirits, and then checking how different their not much in genres, but just their voices. Are they using different, um, just literally different semantics or different pragmatics, and just that would be a place to start, just to sort of even see how different voices are encoded with by the same revelator, but they're supposed to be different originators. And I think that would be an interesting place to look. I probably can think of other of your questions, but I think Anna would have a lot of answers about the genres and poetry and so on.
I want to be conscious of time, David. Do you have like 5 minutes?
Yeah, 5, 6 minutes. Go ahead.
Okay, great. So, Vincent, these are fantastic questions. So incredibly helpful. I would say to the first, I'm not going to answer them all, but I would say to the first that this came up at the recent conference at ASU, that the desperate need to recenter Taoism in the curriculum and to create more bridges, more realms of more pathways of accessibility from all perspectives, from Buddhist scholars to study Taoism more energetically, for students I train, for my PhD students to not approach a Taoist text with fear and concern that they will miss layers of allegory and meaning that are not sufficiently annotated in texts that they have to consult. So I think this has to happen both ways, and I think it needs to be centered as a problem. Because particularly, now I'm just going to speak as a Tong person, that it is almost impossible to overstate the degree to which Taoist language, Taoist concepts, Taoist cosmologies, conceptions of transcendence, divine topography permeate Tong poetry and Tong literature generally. And so you can't really work on the Tong without being sensitive to that. And yet a lot of our traditional literary histories, box off and compartmentalize. Oh, Taoist, and so we study Cao Tang, we study Wu Yun, and that's completely inadequate. But there's still a lot of work to do to recenter, to make students sensitive to readers sensitive to how incredibly important this is, not merely on a kind of chase the illusions, oh, let's identify this object, here's the Qingtong kind of thing, but thinking about how Taoist concepts of the cosmos influenced the representation of the landscape or the representation of time, right? So yes, this is a challenge, and we all need to think about it. I'm thinking about it too. Manuscripts. So just to speak about my piece, because this is a very important question for me right now for the book that I'm working on. So one of the reasons I wanted to use the Wen Cui is that it's compiled in 1011, presented to the court in 1020, and goes into print in 1039, and doesn't go out of print. It becomes one of the most widely consulted anthologies of Tang literature for several hundred years. even though it is superseded. And the fact, however, that it becomes associated with the Gulwen movement and a kind of Confucian antiquity-oriented view of the world is in fact that's what makes the preservation of these Shenxian poems in the Wensui, I think, so important, because it actually captures a much more complex and kind of small c Catholic view of early Northern Song culture that has been erased by historiography about the Song. And I see Li Jiangnan is in the corner. He's in the room. And that erasure of the role of Taoism in Tang culture and Tang literature continues through the means of book culture, which is to say that the book culture and technology also has a compartmentalizing effect, right? Has a siloing effect, that certain things go in the Daozang and other things do not. And I see this in compilations of Tang literature that go on through the Southern Song, that there's a siloing, there's a bracketing off of things that are perceived as having overtly religious content, which may have suited Song interests, but not Tang literary realities. So I think there's a really important story to be told there. Let's see. So let me just say one last thing about genres. And I very much take to heart your point about the fact that we didn't attend to the performing arts and visuality. Song lyrics, I think, could have been included here, very, very importantly, because I think the intersection, and Tyler Fazell is not in the room, but the intersection of things like the Bushitsu and early song lyric tradition, it's clear across the board, and we look at the Dunhuang song lyrics as well, that there are important religious literary performance culture intersections happening in this early, 9th, 10th century evolution. And so I think this is something that's got to be explored. I would also argue, though, that an underexplored or a still to be greater used genre is the genre of the ji, of the record. Because if we look at something like the Weiyuan Yinghua, not just Taiping Guangdi, which we can just do infinite amount of research on, but look at something like the Weiyuan Yinghua and the Daomen or Fuomen sections or even you look at the Stele sections, the number of interactions and comments and reflections on religious phenomena that occur in records and steles and various things, particularly from the post-rebellion period on, these are really, really rich, and I would argue very underexplored. So I would point to that, just to point to one genre that really needs, and the other thing about Ji, of course, that they're recording of social interactions. So they give you a sense of the social dimension of a community. Who are the players? Who wants to be part of this vision? So I think that's. And the last thing that I would say about Steve, gate to access religious experience and visions of authors through poetry, I would temper Steve's hard no with a maybe, which is to say, with respect to Daoist visions, I would argue that for the majority of Tang poetry, the kind of the semiosis of Daoist culture is productive precisely in its ability to give you access to otherness, to alternate visions, whether that's summoning visions of a celestial realm or wandering through the landscape. But I would argue, Steve may say otherwise, that it is not the site of personal self-revelation, that there's that Daoist, kind of Daoist literary culture functions as an alternative vision, alternative realm. And I think I probably won't say more about that, but I think I feel pretty confident about that. And if we want to think about intensely lyrical moments of self-revelation and reflection, I'm now just sort of thinking of I don't know, Dufu or Hanyu, then it's hard for me to come up with, say, Tang poets who use the language of Taoism to do that kind of work. But I think I'll stop there so as not to go off a cliff and get myself in trouble. And I would only underscore Gil's point about exactly that we need an analysis of register shifts, but also more precisely, phonology, tonal euphony, rhyme patterns, which is to say, what does the language of the gods sound like? Very precisely. And so I'll end there. That's not work I've done, but it's work that needs to be done.
Well, thank you very much, Gil, Anna, and Vincent. Yeah, I like how the discussion is opening up interest in reading and rereading this volume. So with that, let's move on to the next volume, Communicating with the Gods, and Elena Valussi will take us into that edited collection.
Thank you, David. And thank you, Ada and Gil and Vincent for starting us on a really wonderful conversation. And I see a lot of connections between the themes that came out of your discussion and the late imperial period. The question of normalizing Taoism, the question of language, the question of the performing arts, opera, theater, all of that is definitely relevant to the late imperial period. And so actually, I find it very exciting that we're not just speaking across genres, but across time periods here. So our volume was developed also from a conference on spirit writing in Chinese history and society, which we held in Erlangen at the University of Erlangen-Nuremberg, specifically at the International Consortium for Research in the Humanities, the IKGF, which supported Matthias and I to organize this conference and to invite 16 international scholars in the field from China, Taiwan, Europe, Japan, and the US in a variety of different disciplines. It was the conference was in June 2019, and we also went through, just like Gil and Anna, the pandemic, having to being challenged by the pandemic in terms of our editing process, but we finally came out with the volume as well. So I would say that this volume marks the field of spirit writing studies is rapidly expanding, and this conference was the first of its kind in the West, and only second to another one held in Taiwan in 2018. And the volume marks the first attempt to produce a comprehensive edited collection of studies on spirit writing in a Western language. Of course, Vincent also published a book on the history of spirit writing at around the same time. This particular book brings together scholars from different geographical areas and fields of research to provide a collection which showcases the variety of forms that spirit writing takes, while at the same time indicating long-standing and common themes and opening up avenues for research. I'm going to just share my screen to show you very briefly the volume itself, what it looks like. There's a really beautiful image right there of women performing spirit writing in the context in the context of literary work, and here are the the volume is divided in 5 parts: overview papers, changing techniques and practices, spirit writing and the literati elites in late imperial China, spirit writing and redemptive societies, and then local communities and transregional networks. And we span a large period of time. This is just an image of women performing spirit writing. And then these are other images and also a contemporary performance, a contemporary spirit writing ritual. And here so we have, as I say, 16 contributions. At the beginning, we have several contributions that give us a sort of a general view, especially starting with Vincent's essay on the emergence of spirit writing in the Song period. Then we have Wang Jianchuan talking about how spirit writing evolves into a communal practice, centering around monasteries and temples. My essay is about female-centered worship and how spirit writing, some practices of spirit writing emerging from within female communities, and then kind of being particularly practiced by male communities in later on in the late imperial period, and then Hu Jiachen's really important essay on the variety techniques and terminologies, which really speak or define both the terminology of the practices and of the implements that are used in spirit writing, which you saw a couple of in those images. So these are important essays because they define, as spirit writing, the field in itself, and the serious study of these practices is quite young. It was important to define techniques, time periods, communities involved in this practice. Then we have the late Ming and Qing dynasty, and especially the explosion in this period of spirit writing communities, the appropriation by Confucian literati, the emergence of trans-regional spirit writing movements, the networks, the different networks, and the Confucian communities. This is one of the elements that I think is really emerges powerfully in this volume, the involvement of at different times of Confucian communities, of Confucian scholars in the practice of spirit writing. Then we have the Republican period, which so-called redemptive societies made widespread use of spirit writing in different ways, and we have several articles on that, several chapters on that, and the tension between spirit writing and modernization and state pressures, and then we have spirit writing today. In China, in Taiwan, in Hong Kong, in fact, we also have one chapter on Japan. So these are this is the main structure of the book and the variety of contributions. And I want to stop sharing and then just say a few things since let me see, yeah. Since we published this book, the field of spirit writing has really developed, and we are really finding that it's becoming clear that spirit writing was not just a marginal religious activity, which is what it has been defined for a very long period of time. In fact, we're only now starting to gain a clearer picture of the earlier period, but we can also safely say that spirit writing, especially in the Ming and Qing, lay at the very center of religious life and religious text production during the Qing dynasty and the Republican period. And we expect a lot more research in this field. There are attempts at tracing and quantifying the amount of religious scriptures produced in this period. CRTA, which I'm sure that Vincent will mention in a minute, is one of those attempts. There are also an increasing amount of publications in the field. There are an increasing amount of conferences in the area, and some areas that I think need to be or are being explored and need to be explored more are regional networks, textual transmission within those regional networks, and in that sense, it's really central for us to work in archives and libraries in China to find evidence of these regional networks and connections between different areas of China and transmission of these texts between different areas of China, but also identifying local specificities, local histories, and how the divinities interact with local communities, and how spirit writing really develops differently in different time periods, but also in different religious communities and in different localities. So I think there's a lot more work to do, and we are doing it though. So I'm very excited about the growth of the field. So I'm just going to stop there.
Okay, thank you, Elena, very much for that introduction of a rich volume. Vincent.
Yeah, thank you again, David. Yeah, I'm equally happy to have this opportunity to discuss the volume edited by Elena and Matthias. Of course, my role, my place here is a little bit different from a moment ago when I was talking about the volume edited by Anna and Gil, in which I played absolutely no part at all. For this volume in spirit writing, I was really part of the team and extremely happy to to be so. So my perspective is a little bit different. But yeah, as so I largely be echoing what Elena said. The volume really is marks a watershed in the history of this young but rapidly expanding subfield of Chinese religion, which is spirit writing. So we know with that volume we have a clear sense of definitions, the boundaries, what is spread writing, what is not, and of the sheer variety of the specific types of spread writing that exist within this one, nonetheless coherent category. That was important because we Elena and the other contributors and we all have that experience when talking about spread writing in an academic conference or even in informal context. Of people who have never been had a chance to see it in person and who don't have a very clear sense of how to define it and where does it stop and how different this is from visualization or mental techniques to speak with the gods or dreams or other ways of producing discursive contents from interaction with non-humans. So the volume is extremely important for that. It really defines the field. It really shows the maturation of a community of scholars interested in this. Um, and I think, Elena, you did not mention, but I think it's important to keep in mind that so part of this community emerged as part of the Daoist project, and that was very important. Certainly, in my own experience, that's the moment when joining the Daoist project, thanks to the late Monica Esposito and then Lai Ji really has almost forced me to read through lots of written literature and realize that this is special. I mean, the way a text is produced has a relationship to its contents, and spirit written texts have a certain dynamics. Right? There are lots of genres within it, of course, but there is a certain dynamic that you can, feel when you read these texts. So that's what really get me hooked to spirit writing. And several of the contributors of that volumes were also contributors to the Dao Zhong Jiao Tiao, the 3-volume annotated catalog of the Dao Zhong Jiao, because lots of its contents was spirit written. This was actually published by a spirit writing group. So we do have, we meet together. We were, Elena and I and some other friends who contributed to the volumes were at another conference on spirit writing in Tokyo last December. So this is a very lively community, which is also very interdisciplinary. Historians, anthropologists, not so many scholars of literature so far. Some we could certainly do more with scholars of Chinese literature, looking at gods as authors, as we were mentioning before. Also, knowing what a spirit written text is help us realize that they are everywhere, especially after the 17th century. When you open a collection of Chinese religious texts that you might qualify as a canon or a collection of texts, Buddhist, Daoist, sectarian, whatever, you'd be very unlikely not to find at least one or two tract or passages or textual element in it that was not spirit written. If I may very quickly share my screen, I think some of you are expecting me to actually show you CRTA, so I'm going to do just that. And show you that within CRTA, we have recently created, so that's the homepage, CRTA. We have recently created a tagging spread-ridden volumes. There are most not texts that have a little spread-ridden text because that would be just most of them. But even, oops, I
I don't see anything. I
Yeah,
don't know
we
if
can't quite
others
see
do.
it, Vincent.
navigated. Okay, I'll just stop screen share. Never mind. I mean, those of you interested can just go to CRTA. And then on the sidebar, there is a category called special pages and then categories. That's where we have tags, with which we can tag text. And we have tagged about 170 different spread written collections that's within CRTA. And that's still just, for the moment, just a small fraction of everything that is in there, right? So it's really everywhere. So my comments would be to continue what Elena was just saying about what should be next. When what's the next stage? What are the most promising developments for this growing field of spirit writing? So local traditions, not something between individual case studies with specific texts or specific authors and the Chinese spirit writing universe as a whole. Something in between the regional traditions with their own techniques, their own gods, their own networks, and so on and so forth. So there be, as Elena said, there is some of this in the volume. Shiga Sensei, Li Guoping, Paul Katz, and others did regional studies, but the Chinese world is so vast, and basically, if you look for spread writing in any part of the Chinese world, you find it, either nowadays or at least in modern times. So we need to fill this map somehow. And then I think we'll find even more diversity than we already are aware of. Another thing the field could do with is more engagement with Buddhist studies. We know, and there was a very nice article early on by Fan Chun Wu talking about Buddhist monks criticizing spirit writing because there was a sort of conflict of authority, monks not willing the gods to take over their role as interpreters of the Buddhist scriptures. But actually, there were lots of Buddhist deities. Guanyin has been talking through spirit writing an awful lot for several centuries. Jigong as well, and lots of bodhisattvas. There were Buddhist spirit writing groups revealing Buddhist spiritual techniques and exercises, how to reach the Pure Land. And that was all taught by spirit writing. And some of it got into the sequel to the Zokuzokyo, the Suzhongxing, right? So they were canonized within Buddhist cycles, right? So more engagement with our friends and colleagues in Buddhist studies would also help. With scholars in the field of medicine as well. Many spread writing groups in late imperial times and down to the maybe a little bit less now still, but at least until the mid 20th centuries were basically healing centers. They were centers for providing medical services. And I think our colleagues in medical history are not so fully aware of this, or have not re-engaged in the kind of work we do. And we have not engaged with their work, right? It's always, it's just a two-way street. So the history of medicine and history of technical knowledge in general, gods imparted lots of technical information and knowledge through spirit writing. And last point, I'll stop with that, is the history of ritual. Because spirit writing it's a ritual technique, right? To create a certain effect through interactions with non-humans, right? With invisibles, gods. And so it also has a lot to tell us about the history of ritual practices in general, whether you call them Confucian, Buddhist, Daoist, sectarian, or else, in early modern and modern China. Just to take one example, the morning and evening daily prayers done in Daoist temples and monasteries today, the Zhao Wanke, have been produced through spirit writing. So there is not like this lay world of spirit writing and the world of the monastics doing rituals in temples. This is basically, I think, the same thing. So history, I mean, all of the work done by the spirit writing studies community that Elena and Matthias have put together in that superb volume is also opens a door to rethinking the history of ritual in modern society from medieval times down to the present. So still a lot of work to do. Thank you again, Elena and Matthias. That's really a major contribution to not only to creating this field, but to the field of Chinese history in general. Thank you.
Thank you, Vincent, very much for those thoughtful comments. Elena, about 10 minutes or so.
Yeah. Thank you, Vincent. I agree with every single item you said, and so it sounds like we've been talking about this closely for so long, and we've been at the same conferences and discussing similar themes. So it sounds like it's not so much of a question and answer, but like a conversation, really. But I agree with with all the areas that we need to work in the future. The area of medicine is particularly interesting to me, and for example, not only medical techniques, but also medical healing in terms of Fu as well, so the sending down of Fu for healing, and that's also a big part of spirit writing. Also the question of religious categories is which also gets back to what Anna and Gil were talking about earlier. The fact that in this large context of spirit writing, which we kind of relegated to Daoist studies because we have Lu Dongbing, we have Wen Chang, we have several important Daoist gods, but we realize that there's a variety of gods that participate, that are sought after by communities for different reasons, and it's very ecumenical. It's not, and so our categories are lacking. I think our own categorization really doesn't match the reality on the ground, and I think it's really important for us to understand this and to rewire or reread these texts in a different way. I know this is about Taoism. This conversation is about books on Taoism, but really, spirit writing is so much more than just within the Taoist field. And we see the engagement of Confucian scholars because they found it useful. We see the engagement of Buddhist scholars because they found it useful. And so therefore, we have to really understand this a little bit differently, move beyond these categories that really have not been very good to us as scholars in many different ways. And so I think that that the spirit writing field really makes this emerge very, very clearly. Even though, for example, the Dao Zhan Jiao is a Taoist canon and is the Taoist canon where a lot of these texts, spirit written texts, are printed. But there's a lot more that are not included in the Dao Zhan Jiao, and we keep finding in all sorts of different other areas and in different other communities. And these communities do not necessarily always call themselves Taoist. In fact, many of these communities we have found, especially in the Southwest area, call themselves Confucian. And so, we have to kind of rethink our categories. And I think that's one of the works that needs to be done in the future. Also, I would add one more area, which actually Vincent mentioned for Anna and Gil's earlier book talk, which is the theater. And I think that's also really important for spirit writing because we see visualized in theater, in opera. We all know that most temples in China have an opera theater, an opera stage, but we see visualized on the stage the relationship between gods and humans that we see described in these spirit writing texts, so that it was important for the communities to not only read the text and receive these texts from gods, but also see that on the stage, visualized on the stage. And I think that's so far has not been explored. But I think the arts and especially theater and opera are really an important, very important element of this. Let me see if there's anything else that I wanted. Oh, the woodblock printing also, again, I'm going back to Vincent's points for Anna and Gil, but I also think, of course, woodblock printing is a very, very important area of the for spirit writing as well, because we do know, of course, that there were local communities that had local printing houses that they used for printing all of the texts that were produced by spirit writing, and that's the way in which they were then, from a vertical transmission, there was a horizontal then transmission throughout China, throughout these local communities. But then also we see a lot of communication between communities on the ground. And again, I want to point out very strongly the work of our colleagues in China, who are now pretty much the only people who can access, and even then, for them, it's really hard, but can access libraries and especially archives, where they find oftentimes first editions of woodblock prints that we then, which are then essential to trace the transmission, this horizontal transmission. So we don't need to only look at the vertical transmission and the relationship between gods and humans, but also the horizontal transmission throughout China. And then finally, I wanted to point out also something that I did in my chapter in this book. I talked about gender and the relationship between goddesses and females and female practitioners, and I think relationships, and I know this is something that Vincent is also working on, relationships between gods and humans. I think this is really important to emphasize. What's that relationship like? What do they talk about? Like these, for example, women and goddesses often talk about female issues, but what do other conversations? What are other conversations like between different gods and different humans, and in different societies, in different localities, in different networks? So I think being more specific about these conversations is also very important. And I'm going to just leave it at that, and maybe David can. And yeah, thanks everybody, and maybe David can take over for the Q&A now.
Okay. Thank you, Elena, very much, and Vincent. At this point, this concludes then the recorded session, or recorded portion of the session. So I'm